Great. Well, welcome back, everybody. I'm Nairi Woods, and I'm Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government. And it is just so glorious to see not just each of you in this room, but to see such a wealth of philosophers in the Blavatnik School of Government. It's something, Jo, that you've succeeded in doing every year you've been here, is finding a way to bring brilliant philosophers into the school. It's not the only way, it's not the only event, but it is a glorious thing. And as Dean of the school, I'd really just wanted to speak very briefly to three things. And the first is why philosophy is so important to the Blavatnik School. Second, why we chose Jo to lead the charge on this. And third, about Jo taking up the inaugural Alfred Landecker chair in the school. And I have a very special message from the co-CEOs of the Alfred Landecker Foundation for you all about that. So I did want to start, though, with why it was that right from the very first idea of a school of government for the University of Oxford, philosophy struck us as important. There is no other school of public policy or government that started with philosophy. And I won't forget, perhaps there are people in this room who were part of it, and she says, looking around carefully, in those planning days before I had the joy of being introduced to Jo, bringing Oxford's most eminent philosophers, sadly, some of whom we've lost, in the intervening time, but bringing them together in my office over on Merton Street to ask them what they thought, how would they use philosophy to build the foundational course for the school, and asking them specifically what they could do in terms of conceptually defining or helping people step their way through the issue of corruption. And they immediately all agreed, it's quite rare to get philosophers to agree, they immediately all agreed that it wasn't an interesting topic for a philosopher. And I was really quite taken aback and said, well, actually, we had President Clinton in the school a couple of weeks ago, and he said, he was explaining that the Clinton Foundation was trying to protect young teenage girls in refugee camps in the Democratic Republic of the Congo who were being systematically assaulted in the night. And that the only way to get security in was to bribe the camp commanders. Was it right to bribe the camp commanders? And Jo, you were one of the first philosophers I talked to. She said, yeah, that's an interesting question. You actually came up with a reading and some, anyway. But philosophy is at the cornerstone of the School of Government because we're in the business of finding and preparing people for public office, whether elected or in the civil service or its equivalent in other countries. And because we're in the business of doing the kind of research that will help governments to do better. And to do that, to do either of those things in today's world, requires at least three things that are really difficult. And the first is, in a smudge of polarized debates, to be forensic about what people are disagreeing about and why. And philosophers do that, I think, better than any other academics. The second is that public life, unlike leading in the private sector or the NGO sector, is all about trade-offs. If you're going to build a school in one village and not in another, then you're giving a great advantage to one group of people and not to another. So how do you make that decision in public life? It's all very well for us to sit in the university and come up with theories about it. But if you're in public life, if you're the person making that decision and having to own it, you need a really clear way of understanding the nature of the decision and of giving reasons for it. And you were slightly more skeptical about philosophy being used to this effect, Jo, in those when we first discussed you coming to the school. I think the thing you were most skeptical of was the first thing I said to you, which is that to me, the Philosophy Foundation's course was a chance to let every student that came to the school begin building their own moral compass, and that it wouldn't be the same for any of them, but that we had to give them the tools to begin to build their own moral compass, because in public life, it's tested not every day, but every minute, as you have to make compromises to do your job. So those were some of the reasons why, right from the beginning of the Blavatnik school, we said the first course that the students will do will be called Foundations and will draw on philosophy in order to help set up these foundations for what they then do. We then had to find philosophers who were willing to step up to this, whatever their, and there were plenty of philosophers who thought we were a bit mad. And when we looked for our first statutory chair in philosophy, I did a lot of due diligence and asked a lot of people about who we should be talking to. We'd done the paperwork stuff. We had noted that there was this philosopher called Jo Wolff who was particularly great at both applying philosophy to public policy problems, was the only philosopher who had produced a book on the philosophy of public policy. But that's not actually why we came for you. I mean, those things were necessary precursors. And we had a short list of people that more or less fulfilled these necessary precursors. But what every philosopher I talked to in Oxford said, and I'm sure most of you agree, which is why you're here, is that Jo was simply a fantastic colleague, that he was a fantastic colleague. And I think all of us here in the Blavatnik School of Government have come to know why Jo's a fantastic colleague. He's just utterly not transactional. He's really good at analyzing other people's transactionalism. But he's really not transactional. When Jo makes a decision to do something or not, he's not like, well, I'll do this if you do that. It's very much, you just step up, step in without measuring, without counting. And that's the Jo that I was told about before you joined the school, and it's the Jo that we've seen every year of you being in the school. It's the mentoring, the reading other people's work, the taking the interest, the being there because nobody else can be, the stepping in to teach the same material 4 times in a row over COVID so that our students could have some exposure in person to an Oxford education. It's the so many ways where I know personally, where I've gone to Jo and said, I know it's a big ask, but could you? And Jo's like, yeah, I could do that. No fuss, no drama, just, yeah, I could do that. And then showing and being there and just doing a wonderful job. And then your enthusiasm for your subject. The most surprising feedback I had about Jo was in the middle of Beijing in the Central Party school, where they were thrilled to have got word that there was a professor in the Blavatnik School of Government hosting discussions of Marxism over pizza in the school. But for our students, that kind of thing, which you've done so much of, Jo, has just been fantastic. It's beyond the Marxism and the pizza. It's been showing students by your own engagement that thinking really hard and making your brain hurt can just be really fun, and that we should do it more just for the fun of it. And you've exuded that, and I'm really grateful to you for exuding that. So I would like now to, and I promise I'm not going to keep on and on at the front of the stage, but I would like, so the school was then approached by the Alfred Landecker Foundation about creating a chair in the name of Alfred Landecker, who perished during the Holocaust and whose family whose family discovered that one of their grandfathers had funded the Nazis and the other had perished in the Holocaust. And so this is Alfred Landecker was the family member who perished in the Holocaust. And this is a message from the co-CEOs of that foundation.
Dear Jonathan, we're very sorry we can't be with you on this important day, but we want to make sure you know how grateful we, the entire Alfred Landecker Foundation team, is to everything that you have contributed to this foundation from the get-go. You were our Landecker Professor of Values and Public Policy and a founding member of the Academic Council, and you have shaped the agenda of this foundation. You have always stressed the moral responsibility that comes with Holocaust remembrance, seeing it not only as an act of memory, but as a living obligation to defend the rights and dignity of all vulnerable groups today. This combination of intellectual depth and moral clarity has made you an invaluable companion on our shared mission and on this journey we started together over 5 years ago. You helped to ground and set up the foundation's work in a way that truly reflects the legacy of Alfred Landecker, turning remembrance of the past into responsibility for the future.
Dear Jonathan, we have valued the clarity of your thinking, your fresh perspectives, and also your specifically Anglo-Saxon lust for debate that was always delivered with a sparkle in your eyes and a grin on your cheeks. And that has certainly been an inspiration, especially for a German context, where debates tend to be sometimes as heavy as our cuisine. The democratic consensus can no longer be taken for granted. When trust in institutions is being undermined and the public debate eroded by algorithms, you kept reminding us time and again, liberties don't just persist. Values don't just persist. They need to be explained, they need to be defended, and they need to be championed. And be sure, we will miss you dearly, and we are thankful for everything you did for this foundation. Don't be a stranger, dear Jonathan. Thank you very much.
There we go. Thank you all for being here, and I hope as philosophers you'll keep coming back to the school. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Great. So, retirement for a philosopher is a paradox. You finally have all the time in the world to think, but nobody is paying you for it anymore. So I guess many of you wonder why is it that Jo has decided to retire, even though he could still work and teach for another year or two. Am I wrong? And I guess the reason is that after decades of deep contemplation about political philosophy and political issues, Jo has decided to meet the greatest philosophical challenge of all. Is there life after work? So just because I've also retired, I want to offer a spoiler. Yes, there is, and it looks rather good. And therefore, Jo, I wish you all the best. I hope that this next chapter brings with it as much joy and meaning as you've shared with students and readers and your family and friends. And yeah, just enjoy it, huh? So I was asked to share something more personal about Jo and how we've been working together and how I perceive Jo's philosophy through our personal relationships. Don't worry. And it often surprises me how certain memories get lodged in our minds while the specifics kind of fade away. And such is my memory of my first meeting with Jo. I can't remember whether it was 94, 95, 96. But at that time, many young philosophers would gather at the annual conference of the Society of Applied Philosophy. And this one, if memory serves, was at Sussex University. So during the first day, Jo gave a paper, and so did I. And in the evening, with little else on offer, we all gravitated to the students' bar, which romantically was called a pub. And, you know, they had two kinds of beer and a bottle of wine, which by all appearances was opened 3 days prior, and the inevitable crisps, a blend of lab-born flavorings and salt, which, let's admit, is rather tasty. Anyhow, the atmosphere was brilliant, and like many young philosophers, in the evenings we sat and drank. Because what's the point of being an academic if not to sit and drink with your friends in a remote campus? So anyway, at a certain moment, Jo came to me and we started to discuss his paper, or was it mine? And then out of the blue, he says, you know, I have an aunt in Ra'anana. Now, Ra'anana is a lovely mid-sized city in Israel where many immigrants from English-speaking countries like to reside. So I go, an aunt? He says, yes. In Ra'anana? He says, yes. So you must be Jewish. So he laughed in a shy sort of manner and he said, yes, but you know, we Brits, we don't come to you and say, hi, I'm Jewish, because that would be too straightforward and impolite, right? So we say, I have an aunt in Ra'anana. So we had a good laugh about English understatements. And then I raised the issue of the aunt again. So do you come often to see her? And he said, no, but I'd love to. So I said, great. We have a house with a spare room. Come and be with us, and you can go and visit her. And several months later, Jo, Elaine, and little Max came to visit. And we had a great time. And this was, I guess, the beginning of a beautiful friendship, as it is said, and undoubtedly laid the foundation for our academic collaboration. So what makes friendship? Yes, Jo is lovable, funny, clever. We've all heard this, incredibly clever. But presumably many people are, so it's a puzzle to me what made me fall in love with him. So I'll say a few words about it later, but the fact is that we kept in touch. And later in Oxford 2002, I spent a sabbatical here with my family. And Jo, as was mentioned earlier, organized this series of seminars, Priority in Practice. And he was working on his paper on disability among equals at that time. I was working on a paper on the vulnerability of climate change migrants and what we owe them as a matter of justice. And we talked about it, and Jo invited me to present the paper. So I came to UCL, I presented the paper, we continued to discuss it. We realized that we shared a lot of thoughts and ideas about why inequality matters and why it's wrong. And we decided to continue discussing this. But I was living in Oxford, in fact, a few hundred yards from here in Jericho. And Jo was living in London. And as you know, the distance between these two cities is much longer than the 90 minutes bus ride. So initially, we started to exchange emails. But then we realized that we had a draft of a paper. And Jo said, why don't you come to my office at UCL and we work on it? So I came to Jo's office at UCL, which was in the building's basement, which is sometimes called in England the lower ground floor. A charmingly optimistic term. And what I saw was a cellar with a tiny window just big enough to catch glimpses of pedestrians' lower parts of their legs when they were passing by. And I don't know if this office was a particularly good source of inspiration for Jo's philosophy, but the room certainly was. Books on the floor, books on the desk, books on the table, books on the chair, books near the window, books everywhere. And I thought, God, I love this guy. So we ended up writing a paper, 18,000 words, which you all know is much too long for a paper. But we had the chutzpah to submit it to a journal, Philosophy in Public Affairs. The old version, may God save its soul. And the editor, I think it was Charles Bites, I'm not sure, was kind enough to say that he had read it, that he thought he had a lot in it, but it's too long for a journal paper. Shouldn't we aim at a book? And the rest is history. We wrote the book Disadvantage together. And people often ask us, what's it like for philosophers to co-author a book? You know, what if you disagree? Well, something must have been good, because after the first book, we continued with several papers, and then the second book, City of Equals. But I think the main reason why we get along together so well is that Jo supports Tottenham, and I support Hapoel Jerusalem in Israel, and the two teams never met. So to use the title of Derek Parfit's book, we have nothing to quarrel about what matters. But of course, we do disagree. So we often refer to something that Levi Eshkol, he was prime minister in Israel when prime ministers wanted to do something good in the world, unlike. And so Levi Eshkol had a very good sense of humor, and he was interviewed by this journalist who said, "Don't you compromise too much for a politician?" And his reply was, "I compromise and compromise and compromise until I get what I want." And I think we worked in a similar vein, and it's been a pleasure. So in what follows, I want to share with you what it means to me to be working with Jo and know him as a philosopher and a friend. But I'll start with my wife. My wife was a kindergarten teacher, and one of the children in her class in one of the years was the son of a very well-known Israeli analytical philosopher, Gilad Bar-Eli. And one day she came home with a very sweet story. She said that the children had been discussing their parents' jobs or works. And Gilad Bar-Eli's son said rather gloomily, "I think my father doesn't work. All day long he sits in his chair and thinks." So this might suggest that philosophers are very egocentric persons who care about the ingenious arguments that they have. And I think that Jo is the exact opposite. When Jo philosophizes, he brings to it care and humanist love for people. Sorry, I'm going to be a little bit sentimental now. So I rarely, if ever, heard Jo speak cynically about others, and I don't think I'd be wrong to say that this approach characterizes not only his relationships with friends, but also his attitude towards human beings and while doing philosophy as well. So before I elaborate on this in theoretical terms and become serious for a second, let me give you an example. It's from the American Philosophical Association, 2008. I wonder if you remember. Well, there was an author meets critics session about our book with Richard Arneson, Martin Nussbaum, and Larry Becker presenting, and the hall was packed. I'm showing off now. The hall was packed with people, and it was great for our ego, and we enjoyed it tremendously. The next morning, Jo remained in his room, and I went to a very early session, I think it was 8 a.m., on environmental justice, a topic that I was working on at that time. When I arrived, there were 3 presenters, 3 PhD students, American PhD students, and me, the entire audience. So I sent Jo a text message, "Good morning, if you're awake, is there any chance you could come to room X? There are 3 sweet PhD students about to present, and I'm the only one in the audience." It took Jo 3 minutes to arrive, even without his morning tea. And the session began, and the 3 papers were just brilliant. They were so interesting. So Jo and I stand, and after it ended, and discussed these issues with them. But for me, it was natural, right? I mean, environmental justice was my academic baby at that time. But I was genuinely astonished by how Jo engaged philosopher with these young scholars. First, though it wasn't his academic expertise, his contribution was extremely constructive. But that I expected. I had already known how clever he was. What struck me was how genuinely interested he was, not just in the papers, but in the students themselves. And the way he discussed with them their thoughts about the careers, what they wanted to do in the future, why they wanted to do it, do they have any hesitations. It was so beautiful to see. In Yiddish, we say a true mensch. In liberal philosophy, we say a genuine humanist. And how is this attitude of genuine humanism portrayed in his work? So first, I think of 3 things. First, in what philosophy should focus on. It may seem a bit odd that one of the major contributions of our first book, Disadvantage, is a definition of disadvantage. Odd because Jo isn't particularly interested in definitions. I think he often cites Nietzsche, who said that any concept with a history doesn't have a single definition, but many. Only that which doesn't have a history can be defined. And Jo finds it almost a waste of time when analytical philosophers devote excessive attention to minor twits in existing definitions, hoping to get it right, and then somebody else comes and refutes it, and so on and so forth. Jo thinks this is extremely interesting, but not necessarily fruitful. He believes that the injustices in the world across many spheres are too urgent for us as political philosophers to get stuck on conceptual hair-splitting, and instead we should think about how to directly address these injustices and find ways and explain why we should find these ways to correct these injustices. So at first glance, Jo's view might seem too radical because at the end of the day, the way you define a problem constitutes the way you try to solve it. So I would correct myself and say that Jo is not uninterested in definitions, but in the obsession with definitions. And he values them only insofar as they can help us understand the injustice at stake and propose way to overcome it. So that's the first way. The second way is in which Jo's care for people shows in his work is in his belief about what should motivate political philosophers. Jo often wonders whether the work done by political and moral philosophers over the years can actually be translated into policy recommendations. One option is to say, of course they can, this is what applied philosophy is all about. The other option is to give up, to say, there's the world of policy, there was the world of theory, the world of policy is governed by power and power games, and the most a political philosopher can do is to point to where things are unfair. And then there's a third option, which is to acknowledge that there are differences between theory and practice, theory and policy. Partly because one criterion for a good theory is that it's short, elegant, and easy to grasp. But the world, as Jo often says, is much messier than that. So the idea is to acknowledge that there is this messiness, nevertheless not to give up about and to try to find the bridge, to bridge those gaps. And it's hard. It's not what editors of journals like. It's not what will earn you lots of citations, but it will improve dramatically people's well-being. So that's the second way in which his care is manifested in his work. And it brings me to the third and most important manner in which I associate Jo's philosophy with care and love for people. The way he writes and mainly teaches. We all know that there are a few philosophers, not us, but there are a few philosophers engaged in contemporary analytical philosophy who apply an argumentative and confrontational style. What they like to do is they adopt a Socratic style aiming to lead you to a corner, to a dead end, and force you to admit that you've always been wrong. Jo, however, never ever employs such a style. It is important to Jo that the student, colleague, or anyone he debates with, including me when we were working together, feels good at the end of the discussion. Jo finds a way to present his claim while also ensuring that the other person feels clever and insightful, even if Jo has proven them wrong. And in my view, this approach is a form of art. And I learned a lot by watching Jo lecturing or debating, or even when we taught a course together in Croatia. Do you remember a few years ago? It was a pleasure to see how he was discussing philosophical matters with his students. So to conclude, I truly believe Jo's work fits this description perfectly, partly because I wrote it, but also at its core, Jo's philosophy is full of care, compassion, a deep love for people. Impact for Jo is not measured by citations, but by the tangible ways his philosophy improves the well-being of others. Indeed, he has thoughtfully addressed many issues that could improve the lives of many, those with disabilities, the disadvantaged, train passengers, NHS clients, gamblers, even gamblers, he cares for gamblers, and others. And if I may add on a very personal note, his work and the experience of working with him has greatly improved my own life. Thank you. Thank you. Please welcome to the stage Barry Smith, Philippe Van Parijs, and David Edmonds to discuss public philosophy and Jewish thought in the 20th century.
Welcome to the final session of the day and this panel on public philosophy and Jewish thought in the 20th century. I think we'll spill over into the 21st century as well, I hope. In a moment, I'll introduce you to the speakers and also introduce the theme a little. But first, I want to, as is customary today, say a few words about Jo and how we met. And it's a great, great pleasure to be here to honor a friend, philosopher, and guide to academic life. And Jo and I were colleagues in the University of London in philosophy, belonging to different departments. I was at Birkbeck College and Jo was at UCL, but we shared a common cause at the time. And when we met, we were both teaching on the University of London's federal degree in philosophy. That was taught by 5 colleges, and it was the same exams and the same program across all of these colleges of the University of London. As we became more modular and as colleges of the university decided they were universities and they were to be run by captains of industry, and the university started to unravel a little, as philosophers, we kept the faith and continued to offer this federal degree in philosophy, but we needed very, very sophisticated and difficult arguments to persuade the administrators that they couldn't abolish us. We managed to do that until 2005, which was really quite remarkable. But for me, the big contribution that Jo made to my career was when I became chair of the Department of Philosophy at Birkbeck, and Jo was chair of UCL. And the heads of the departments used to meet. They were known as the meeting of the 5 families when we would get together with UCL, King's, Birkbeck, LSE, and Heathrow. And I was new to this post, but had watched Jo running his department, and I would constantly ask for advice and get very good advice. And he was a tremendous help and mentor in how to do this difficult job of corralling rather difficult argumentative people into sharing a common cause and a common purpose. But we've talked about Jo's kindness, his warmth, but he's also tough when he needs to be, and he was tough with me when he needed to be. And on several occasions I learned my lesson when I was engaged in long, protracted emails trying to persuade him of the virtue of our point of view. I learned something from him which I've since deployed to great effect with others, which is to just reply by saying, I'm sure we've both got better things to be getting on with. And that was a very useful way to end the conversation. How could you admit we didn't? We had to do that. There was one other famous time when I was insisting on a matter of principle, I think, as the chair of the subject panel in philosophy. And Jo just very gently said, that's a very high horse you're on at the moment. And I didn't take offense, but I took a lesson, and it was a useful lesson, and it was a necessary lesson, so I was glad of it. But like so many lessons that Jo has given me, one which I have quoted and acknowledged my debt to him in saying, one message which is very worth repeating, helps to structure this session a little bit. I've often had to tell colleagues, when they're saying, well, I want to get on with philosophy. I don't want to have to do all these other things that I'm being told to do, of engaging with the public, engaging with policymakers, talking to other disciplines, talking to other sectors. I often just quote Jo's remarks, what's the point of doing all this research if others don't get the benefit of it? And I think that's a really wise and important thought. Now that's why public philosophy has always mattered to Jo in the work that he does. And I think it's interesting that we've been talking about the public value of philosophy and how much it matters. But we're also in this session going to consider a little bit Jewish thought in the 20th century and a roll call of really impressive and important figures who were both philosophers and had a much larger role in the public sphere. And David Edmonds is going to talk about that. But if I think, what is distinctive there about Jewish thought in the 20th century? Fierce intellectual focus, but also a desire to share that thinking with others, to make sure it's communicated. But also an awareness of the consequences of what you're saying, some of the dangers of it. But when I add that to the list of attributes for Jo, there's another one to add, which is bringing other people into the conversation and ensuring they're included. I think that's very much characteristic of his work, and we're going to look at that shortly. People have talked about how profound Jo's thinking is, how insightful, how deep it is, but he also has that knack of boiling it down to the essentials, getting to something which you can communicate really quite clearly, forcefully and effectively. And that serves him both in talking to a wider public, talking to other disciplines, but also to philosophy itself, finding the right questions. And I was struck when reading his introduction to political philosophy that he says in characteristic Jo style, yeah, well, there are really just two questions here. Who gets what and who decides who gets what? And I think that's it, that's perfect. When people ask me, what should I say political philosophy is about? There you are, boiled down, like a good aphorism, but also something deep and resonant that you can go on thinking about. Now that style to communicate publicly and to share his work with others led to him having a much more public role than just the ones that inform policymaking, because he was, as many of you know, enlisted to be a columnist on The Guardian, and for many years we enjoyed reading Jo's thoughts and observations. One of my favorites from that time was when a journalist had asked him, why are people dropping philosophy from the curriculum? Why are people dropping out of philosophy? And he didn't just immediately launch into what he thought was a wrong assumption. He starts with a wonderful anecdote. The anecdote about Charles II, who addressed the Royal Society. And Charles II said to the scientists assembled in front of him, why is it that a fish, when dead, weighs more than it does when it's alive? I'm going to give you a week to give me an explanation. They all scurried off. They came back with elaborate explanations. And when they were assembled, Charles said, so I asked you, why does a fish when it's dead weigh more than it does when it's alive? And the answer is, it doesn't. And thus he knew exactly how to assess the people who'd come up with the alternative explanations. And as Jo said to the journalist who had asked why people were dropping philosophy, they're not. And went on to give a defense of how good and employable a skill philosophy was and how much it does for us. So there's wit there as well as depth, and I think that's important to public communication. And I think many of us will have enjoyed Jo's contributions on Twitter now on Blue Sky with his aperçu, or we might say Jo's haikus, where he just boils them down to some beautiful observation. One of my favorites is to do or to-do list. I think anyone interested in administration really ought to keep that in mind. So the thing is really that when it comes to Jo's own question, he has made sure his work is of benefit to others, and it really has shown there was a point in doing that research because of the number of people, the number of disciplines, the number of fields who have benefited from it, as we see here today. So we have two people to address this theme with us. And let me just tell you a little bit more about who they are. We have Philippe Van Parijs, who is Emeritus Professor at the University of Louvain. He chairs the advisory board of Basic Income, the Basic Income Earnings Network at the Brussels Council. He's also part of the network of the Brussels Council for Multilingualism. And with the LSE economist Paul de Graaf, he set up ReBel, Rethinking Belgium's Institutes. His books include Real Freedom for All, Just Democracy, the Rawls Machiavelli Program, and Basic Income, a Radical Proposal for a Free Society and a Sane Economy. He's a columnist with the Brussels Times. David Edmonds is a distinguished research fellow at Oxford's Uhuru Institute. He's a presenter, an award-winning documentary maker for BBC Radio. He has also written many books, including Would You Kill the Fat Man, which is very well received. He's written a biography of Derek Parfit, a philosopher and his mission to save morality. And very much related to this session on Jewish thought is his excellent book, The Murder of Professor Schlick, The Rise and Fall of the Vienna Circle. But in terms of public philosophy, he's very much known for the work that he did and the co-production he has with Nigel Warburton of Philosophy Bites, a very early philosophy podcast, which now has just under 50 million downloads, which is a huge service to philosophy. So I'm going to ask each of them to give us their thoughts and reflections on this topic. And Philippe, if we could start with you, please.
Well, to the many beautiful things that have been said about Jo by people who've known him far better than me, I'll just add 4. One is that our relationship, my relationship with Jo, goes back to the late 1980s when he hosted the September Group for several years at UCL after Jerry Cohen had moved from UCL to Oxford. And I think he was not only hosting the September Group, but also checking that none of us was stealing or destroying UCL's property. I think that was one of your functions there. 2, I shall also add that I've always found Jo's writings in both political and ethical substance and in intellectual and humoristic style extremely congenial. 3, I have, with some gratitude, must mention that I owe to him that I currently possess Brian Barry's the DPhil thesis, not his thesis, but his gown, more important than his thesis. And finally, I'll mention that I discovered his beautifully written columns in The Guardian, thanks to my wife, who forwarded one of them, entitled, Why Do Academics Dress So Badly? She forwarded to me, not only because she thought it applied to me more than to any other philosopher she had ever met, but also because it contained a very unusual, but to me very welcome rehabilitation, or perhaps habilitation, of a piece of garment which I've been wearing for about 20 years, which I think is usually called a body warmer. It's something I can recommend it. I have one in my bag there. It's, okay, apparently it's not particularly elegant. Anyway, thank you to Jo for all these things. Now Now, but I haven't come here in order to advise you on how to dress if you want to be a public philosopher. But what I want to do is rather mention a number of things about being a public philosopher that bother me to some extent. And I'll do so first by mentioning two features which I regard as essential to our role as public philosophers today: realistic utopianism and responsible inexpertise. I'll mention two dangers that threatened any public intellectual, but not least any public philosopher: naivety and vanity. And three, I'll mention three temptations that are specific to public philosophers and which I fear sometimes I can't resist. One is ex post justification, two is Socratic teasing, and three is a complacent reconciliation. So, two features essential to my interpretation and enactment of our role as public philosopher, as philosophe engagé. Sounds better in French than it does in English, and more general as public intellectuals or intellectuels engagés. Realistic utopias. But utopias must not be meant as just a blueprint of a better societies, not only big things like democratic socialism, but only, for example, just getting at long last Broad Street car-free. That's also a utopia, so it's this whole range of things. So we must be realistic utopians. Being utopians means that we must propose things, not only oppose, we must imagine, not only denounce, and at the same time, we must be realistic, which means, going back to a distinction made by Ingrid earlier today, which means that what we propose must be sustainable, not only desirable, but it doesn't need to be. In fact, that's what makes it utopian. It is not immediately achievable. It doesn't need to be politically realizable. Indeed, arguing for its desirability must contribute to making it achievable. So we must be realistic utopians. We must also be responsible non-experts. Meaningful interventions in public debate today require going beyond the very narrow boundaries of our own personal expertise. Not doing so would be irresponsible, would be expecting far too much from policymakers, expecting far too much from political leaders and their teams. But both these features, so realistic utopia, being realistic utopians and responsible non-experts when intervening in the public debate, point immediately to a first danger that is always lurking in when we try to be public philosophers. First one, I said, naivety, being ignorant or simply neglect information, insights that can only be gained from other disciplines. Being a public philosopher, and that's very neatly illustrated, I think, in the book A City of Equals, requires reading a lot of stuff that is written by non-philosophers, not only by other academics, and trying to understand it. It also means constantly asking for advice, for guidance, for feedback from colleagues from other disciplines. Because without their help, constant help, there is no way of assessing what is sustainable and what is not, and there is no way of combining being a non-expert when intervening in public debate and being responsible. So, first general danger, naivety. Second general danger, vanity. That is, the expectation that it will be enough for you, for us, to propose an idea, to spell out why this idea is such a good idea for policy makers, for politicians, to quickly turn it into reality. We may be encouraged to hold this over-optimistic view by John Maynard Keynes' famous statement, and on the last page of his general theory, when he says, and I'm quoting just one sentence from it, the ideas of economists, he wrote, and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else. Okay, but my own experience is that if you want your ideas to make a difference, it requires far more than an opinion piece, a few interviews on television. It requires a lot of not very public work of organization, coordination, trust building, team building. Just two quick examples. For example, what I did for the dissemination of the idea of universal basic income, of non-conditional basic income, was above all, to what my contribution to it was above all the often tedious, very time-consuming, very demanding, and very non-public work, which I did for 16 years as the secretary and newsletter editor of that small network that had been created when I gathered a few people in Louvain-la-Neuve in 1986. My job consisting in trying to identify and then linking together the few people that I had managed to find at the time and had at least come up with support for something that looked a bit like that idea. That network became a global network. It will hold its 24th Congress next month in Rio de Janeiro, but it would not exist had it not been for these very obscure years that were spent collecting membership fees and stamping stamps on envelopes in order to, the younger generation doesn't know what a newsletter meant in the previous century. But without this network would never have existed. It nearly died several times on the way. I could tell similar stories about many other things I've been involved with. For example, just mention my most spectacular success next to countless failures, which I'm not going to mention, which was a movement of civil disobedience, which was triggered by an opinion piece I wrote, both in Dutch and French. We have to do double work in Belgium every time. So under the title Picnic the Streets, plus you have to find a title that is linguistically neutral, and the movement of civil disobedience that led then to the full pedestrianization, the car-freeness of Brussels Central Lane. But there again, beyond, it's not just enough as a public philosopher to write an opinion piece and then to be interviewed a couple of times on the local television for it to happen. In fact, what you need to do is the perseverance afterwards, the team building, having a team that keeps pushing until then 3 years later it becomes irreversible. These are the two general dangers. Naivety, if you think as a philosopher you know what needs to be done. No, you need to be constantly listening to countless other people from other disciplines. And secondly, vanity thinking, it's enough to have these bright ideas for them to be realized. No, it requires a lot of work. And again, a lot of work with lots of other people and not particularly academics among them. Then I quickly turn to the three temptations. The first one is exposed justification. I mentioned earlier that I first met Jo in the context of the September Group, also known as the non-bullshit Marxist group, founded in 1981 at the initiative of Jerry Cohen, Jon Elster, and John Römer. Now, in August 1993, Jon Elster decided to leave the group after 12 years of very assiduous participation in it. And he wrote to Jerry a letter which he asked him to read to the comrades, and which Jon allowed me to quote in a contribution to a forthcoming volume about his work. I quote a passage from that letter. Over the years, Jon writes, several things happened that made me more disenchanted with the group. I think the decisive experience was the round of discussions we had of the guaranteed minimum income, UBI. I was suddenly struck, as I said at one of our meetings, by a tendency to put the cart before the horse, to begin with a conclusion and then look for suitable premises to support them. This was getting dangerously close to bullshit at a high level. I couldn't call it dogmatism, rather a kind of wishful thinking. Once I'd had that experience, many of our discussions struck me as similarly irrelevant. To put it simply, there was a lack of common sense that over the years put me off. Am I guilty of putting the cart before the horse? Whether for UBI, with my longish book, Real Freedom for All, or with a number of other ideas that appealed to me over the years, for example, the so-called linguistic territoriality principle in my book, Linguistic Justice. Maybe that's what I've been doing. So as my job as a public philosopher, or more generally as a political philosopher, not simply consisted in providing a more or less sophisticated ex post philosophical justification for this idea that struck me as very attractive. Perhaps, but perhaps this is okay. 2, Socratic teasing. I seem to be increasingly driven into playing the devil's advocate, into a challenger of the pensée unique that prevails around me. For example, I occasionally say that, even right, surely Viktor Orban is not a very nice guy, despite the fact that he's been educated here in Oxford, and it's not very kind or fair of him not to take his share of refugees. But wouldn't you also be legitimately concerned if you were the boss of a small country with a population that has been shrinking year after year since 1980, with an impossible language spoken by hardly anyone else outside the country, if you suddenly had to host and integrate tens of thousands of Arabic-speaking migrants? Or, other example, surely there is a multidimensional unjust inequality suffered by women, but should we not also worry about the deepening and pretty universal educational gap between boys and girls? Isn't that also a form of injustice? I could give you more examples, including some that got me into some trouble, but I started wondering whether I was suffering from some pathological contractarianism, until I read this liberating sentence in an essay on the Ukraine war by the French public philosopher Etienne Balibar. I quote, "The philosopher's vocation," he says, "includes a sort of parrhesiastic," first time I saw that word, ex officio duty, called a devoir d'état, which is to disagree within his own camp. So I went to look up what is this parrhesiastic, and I found a lecture by Michel Foucault in Berkeley in 1983 that is devoted to this notion of parrhesia, defined as taking the risk of losing one's popularity because one's opinion is contrary to the majority's opinion. And Michel Foucault defends the courage of practicing parrhesia, courage that has been ascribed both to Socrates and to Jesus. So perhaps, after all, it's not too bad to go for these Socratic teasing. Finally, complacent reconciliation also bothers me occasionally. Some of you may remember the beginning of Rawls's Justice as Fairness. So it's sort of summarizing book that he published very late in his life. And he mentions there are 4 rules for political philosophy. The last one is realistic utopia. I referred to it before. But the previous one is, he calls reconciliation, or Versöhnung. He uses the Hegelian term. Political philosophy, he says, may try to calm our frustration and rage against our society and its history by showing us the way in which its institutions, when properly understood from a philosophical point of view, are rational and developed over time as they did to attain their present rational form. As I grow older, I don't know whether that happens also to you, Jo, you are younger than me, but it may still come if you keep thinking, of course, and don't retire fully. So as I grow older, I find myself less and less possessed by anger against injustice or absurdity, and more inclined to settle for imperfection, to recommend compromises, for example, in the context of the war in Ukraine. This is not quite the Hegelian recognition of the rationality of the present, or the Leibnizian recognition of the optimality of the world, but it's certainly an attitude that runs the risk of undermining my utopianism. Is this a problem? Yes, I think it is a problem, and it might also have been a problem for Rawls, reconciling these 2 roles for political philosophy. Maybe it's also a problem for Jo, so I would like to know, so that if you tell me it's not a problem, then I'll feel reassured. If you tell me it's a problem, I'll have to think about this aspect and all the others. Anyway, Jo, thank you very much for all you did to help me think about these issues and many others.
Is that working?
Yes.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I've been asked to speak about an unusual topic, which was Jo and Jewishness. So let me tell you something about my link with Jo. I already knew him a bit. I think we'd done a couple of interviews for Philosophy Bites. When about 15 years ago, I asked him to appear on a radio programme. So I was working for the BBC at the time, and the programme was called The Philosopher's Arms. The boozer Karl Marx would certainly have approved, because each programme was recorded in a different pub. And this particular programme was about Nozick's experience machine, which you probably all know about. You imagine a machine you can plug in, you could have the perfect life, you could be an Oxford professor, all your students could love you, you could be elected president of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and none of it was real, but it was the perfect life. In any case, before booking Jo, I thought I'd better do some due diligence. It's not something that BBC producers do these days, as you probably read in the news, but I'm very much, I'm old school. So I Googled Jo online, and somewhere I found a short bio. And this explained that Jo had been raised in southeast London, that he'd specialised in philosophy, he'd been a Harkness Fellow in the United States, and his father had arrived in the UK from Germany on the Kindertransport. So this was amazing news for me, because I was raised in southeast London, I specialised in philosophy, I was a Harkness Fellow in the United States, and my father had arrived in the UK on the Kindertransport. I think there can be no 2 people in the world who share 3 of those 4 characteristics, and there certainly is no one in the world, apart from the 2 of us, who share all 4. So I wrote an article later on about Jo, and I repeated this story, and I added that it was just a shame that our fathers, Herbert and Herbert, had never met. In fact, the connections were even weirder than this. So both our fathers, both the Herberts, had travelled to the UK on the Kindertransport with a sister. Jo's aunt was called Lottie, the name of my father's mother. The Herberts had actually been raised in different cities, but only 75 miles apart. So Jo's father is from Frankfurt. My father came from Karlsruhe. Jo's PhD supervisor, and a very important influence on him, was Jerry Cohen. So Jerry, as it happened, was also a close friend of our family. My uncle Ralph had shared a house with him for several years. And when Jerry got married, remarried, I should say, my uncle went to his wedding and later told me how it went. So the best man said to the assembled group, "There's something I need to tell you." Or, he said in sotto voce voice, conspiratorially, "I really can't keep it to myself any longer. I've known about it a long time, but today's the perfect day to reveal it. And I hope it doesn't come as too much of a shock. So I trust you're all sitting down." But, and the best man paused for dramatic effect, "Jerry's Jewish." So the joke, of course, was that the one thing everybody knew about Jerry Cohen was that he was Jewish. So Cohen was raised in a working-class Montreal community that managed to be both communist and intensely Jewish, though Das Kapital was probably regarded as a more sacred text than the Talmud. So even Cohen was puzzled by how Jewish he was. "Why do I feel so Jewish?" he asks in a preface to one of his books. So I doubt that everybody knows that Jo is Jewish in quite the same way. Wolff is a common Jewish name, but it's not a giveaway like Cohen. Jo could, as it were, pass in wider society. Jo is, in a word I think Woody Allen once used, Jewish. Or, as Woody Allen also once said, I think it was Woody Allen said this, he's Jewish, but only on his parents' side. Jo's maternal side of the family was from East Europe. His mother was raised in Bournemouth, which had one of Britain's largest Jewish communities and sustained several kosher hotels because it was a popular Jewish holiday resort. Most famous, I've done my research, was the Green Park Hotel run by Bubba Richman, described as a heavy smoker who would curse out loud in Yiddish and cheat in cards. But Jo's great-uncle and aunt ran a kosher hotel too, the Trouville Hotel, which was requisitioned during the war. Jo was bar mitzvahed, under protest, he says, but Jewish identity was not then important to him. Some of the things he's written subsequently might suggest that it was even the source of some discomfort. That's changed. In theory, we should be more interested in our origins when we're young. After all, knowing about the lives of our parents and grandparents might explain the circumstances in which we grow up. But of course, kids don't care about this stuff. Much later on, when it's far too late, we regret not asking our grandparents questions that could fill in facts that have now come to fascinate us. Our roots intrigue us more as we age. Genealogy sites are mostly popular among people in their 50s and older. In this sense, Jo is typical. I think the fate of his paternal grandparents, who were put on transport to Lodz in Poland, where a vast ghetto had been established, but who never arrived and were presumably shot en route, has become to affect him more forcefully than before. But it can't be coincidence, it can't be entirely unrelated to his background, that Jo's interests have always been inequality and disadvantage, exploitation, nationalism, and human rights. And I think it's worth placing Jo in a 20th century tradition. So, what do the following people have in common? Hannah Arendt, Adorno, Raymond Aron, Sailor Ben Habib, Isaiah Berlin, the aforementioned Jerry Cohen, Bonnie Dworkin, Nancy Fraser, Ernest Gellner, Amy Gutman, Agnes Heller, H.L.A. Hart, Max Horkheimer, Stephen Lukes, Herbert Marcuse, Robert Nozick, Karl Polanyi, Karl Popper, Joseph Raz, Michael Sandel, Judith Sklar, Leo Strauss, Michael Walzer, Simone Weil, and Robert Paul Wolff. Well, you probably guessed it, they're all Jewish, and in one way or another, they've all contributed to political theory. It's an incredible list, and I could have added numerous other names to it. Now, in some ways, this reflects a broader Jewish contribution to 20th century philosophy, where one might name-check, another list, one might name-check Ayer, Bergson, Butler, Cassirer, Cavell, Arthur Danto, Derrida, Herbert Feigl, Fodor, Philip Frank, Nelson Goodman, Husserl, Shelley Kagan, Francis Cam, Kripke, Thomas Kuhn, Emmanuel Levinas, Ernest and Tom Nagel, Neurath, Peter Singer, Putnam, Reichenbach, Tarski, Judith Thompson, Friedrich Weissmann, Richard Wollheim, and Wittgenstein, and dozens and dozens and dozens of others. So this, in turn, is part of the extraordinary flowering of Jewish intellectual life, which began in earnest with Jewish emancipation in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, a flowering that would produce Marx, Einstein, Freud, and Kafka. However, the predominance of Jews within political theory, in particular, is notable. Of course, the line between philosophers in political theory and those operating in other philosophical fields is vague and arbitrary. There are thinkers who work in multiple domains within philosophy. Karl Popper's political theory was closely related to his philosophy of science, and in fact it was his philosophy of science that came first. Still, and to repeat, the number of Jewish political theorists seems to require an explanation. And really, an explanation is not too hard to find. Being treated unfairly will inspire reflections on equality and justice. Being deprived of citizenship will encourage examination on the nature of rights and the relationship between the state and the individual. Being on the receiving end of racism and xenophobia will prompt investigation into nationhood and nationalism. It's easy to take existing norms and structures as somehow natural and immutable, as being obviously the best and the right way to organise affairs. It requires a leap of imagination to recognise alternative ways that society might be arranged and even improved. That leap of imagination is less effort for those who are marginalised. In response to anti-Semitism and the Holocaust, one might expect one of two broad responses among Jews. First, never again to us. Second, never again to anyone. In other words, and to put the dichotomy crudely, there might be those who particularise lessons from the cataclysm and those who universalise them. It's understandable that some Jews have been more disposed to respond in the former way. Zionism, born in anti-Semitic Vienna in the late 19th century, was the logical conclusion to the thought that Jews would never be safe in Gentile society, as history had apparently repeatedly shown. But most Jewish political theorists have been universalists. Rather than focus specifically on Jewish experience, the emphasis has been on developing or critiquing general abstract principles. Sure, the status of oppressed groups is pertinent to debates about freedom, justice, and equality, but the variable, the oppressed group, might be Jews, or it might be African Americans or women. It might be a group based on sexuality or on religious belief. Jo, I'm pleased to report, tends towards this universalist approach. The distinction between the two approaches was starkly brought out in a bitter exchange between Hannah Arendt and her fellow German-born intellectual and erstwhile friend, Gershom Scholem. It followed publication of Arendt's account of the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. Scholem accused Arendt of lacking love and empathy for, quote marks, her own people. Arendt responded angrily, "I have never in my life loved any people or collective." Now, it's worth saying that this universalist approach has not always been driven by entirely admirable instincts. Many Jewish philosophers, especially those born before World War II, internalized the pervasive prejudices of the society in which they were raised. They were eager to convert or to assimilate and to downplay their origins. Not a political theorist, of course, but Wittgenstein is a notorious example. When he drew up his confessions in the 1930s and insisted on inflicting an account of them to his friends, one of his sins was to allow people to believe he was less Jewish than he was. Wittgenstein, perhaps the most original of all 20th century philosophers, felt that he was incapable of thinking originally. He was only capable of thinking reproductively, and that this was a characteristic of Jews. Wittgenstein was a great admirer of Otto Weininger, the Jewish author of the misogynist and anti-Semitic Sex and Character, who, to demonstrate his genius, shot and killed himself in the house in which Beethoven had also died. Weininger and Wittgenstein were far from alone. Popper became very agitated when the editor of the Jewish Yearbook, a sort of who's who of Jews, asked whether he would like to appear in it. And then there's Hannah Arendt, already mentioned. She's acquired a saintly image in the past few decades, but at the very least, she revealed a snobbery towards East European Jews, who, on the whole, were much poorer and less well-educated and cultured than the Central European Jews from Berlin, Vienna, or Prague. She writes approvingly of the 3 German-born judges presiding over the Eichmann trial, and disobligingly of Gideon Hausner, the Polish-born prosecuting lawyer. Of course, the doyen of Jewish political theorists, Karl Marx, had written essays entitled On the Jewish Question, and his published works are dotted with anti-Semitic remarks. He once wrote, "We find every tyrant backed by a Jew, as is every pope by a Jesuit." And here's a quote from on the Jewish Question. "Let's not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. What is the secular base of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering. What is his worldly God? Money. Very well then, emancipation from huckstering and money." So let me finish with a contentious sociological claim for which I have no strong empirical evidence. Indeed, it's hard to know how one could quantify the claim I'm about to make. It seems to me that the truly extraordinary Jewish contributions to intellectual life generally, and political theory in particular, are a combination of freedom and fear. Freedom to think and write, freedom from the censor's knife, liberation from the narrow confines of a religious life. But fear too, fear of political upheaval, fear for one's livelihood and even one's life, fear for one's very identity. A pleasure of travelling abroad is that one experiences an assault on the senses. One feels more alive. One has heightened awareness of scents, smells and sounds because the environment is alien. I think a less benign version of this has been experienced by the Jewish community. A sense of impending danger has sensitized intellectual antennae. In the past half a century, by no means all, but many Jews in the US and Western Europe have been successful materially and professionally. And my sense has been that a more contented but less fertile state of bourgeois stability has set in. That is beginning to change. We are a very, 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 very long way from the circumstances that brought my father and Joe's father to England. But every Jew knows that over the past few years in Britain and elsewhere, the climate has deteriorated. It's not my place here to discuss why this is so, but the fact is that a degree of menace is back in the air. I suppose, however, that what is in almost every way bad for Jews might turn out to be good news for Jewish scholarship.
Thanks, Dave and Philippe. We will have plenty of time for questions, but let me, while you're thinking of your questions, let me just ask both of you something to begin with. So I was very interested, Philippe, with this idea of responsible inexperience, because, or inexpertise that you talk about. Certainly you want to encourage people to speak about more than their narrow specialism, but how do you yourself judge whether you're in a position to do that? You talked about having to read more broadly, having to inform yourself, but how do you judge when someone approaches you, say from the media or some other sort of public forum and says, would you talk about this? How do you assess whether you're in a position to do that?
Well, one, you don't accept everything that's asked from you. And so a number of things you can say, well, one, I don't know, and it's enough about that, and two, I won't have time to delve enough into the issues that are raised. And so, and then on the issues, sometimes then you feel you have to intervene on your own initiative, and then because it's already partly within the things you know something about, and then before doing so, then you, so I should take a number of examples. Some are, of course, often very local. In the Brussels context now, we had elections in June last year. We still no regional government. It's due to the fact that our institutions are, although they were sensible at the very beginning, they are no longer sensible now. And so with a number of other people, constitutionalists, political scientists, economists also to some extent, demographers, and so we've been reflecting on an alternative. And so it's essential for each of us to go beyond the very small expertise. Otherwise, you expect too much from the people who have to take decisions. But before saying something, you take the time to inform yourselves. And so that's why I've always found it so fantastic to be within a university. University is this sort of treasure of knowledge where you have people around you who feel some solidarity with you because you belong to the same institution, and who you can go and ask and say, I would like to say something on this topic, can you advise about what I should read, or this is the first draft of what I would like to write, can you have a look at it and then tell me what's wrong or where. And so it's really, and that's where the way in which we have to be responsible. We can't just say things cheaply, so you really need two things: not accept everything, and so not think you have something interesting to say on every topic, and two, you intervene when you have something to say that not everyone else has said before, and where you can take the time of informing yourself and getting the right sort of insights.
It's very good advice, and obviously anyone who does accept an invitation to speak about just anything is falling into your trap of vanity, I would have thought, particularly. But how do you also assess the responsibility of the forum where you're invited? Because these days, as someone who's held, difficult, tough, maybe unpopular views, you might be invited particularly because they want to set you up or because they want you to be the person that other people can challenge or attack. So are you also very careful about the invitations you select because of who's inviting you to speak?
My general answer is no. And so I'm very strongly against the cordon sanitaire de la parole. And so we have this French expression that seems to have spread in other languages. In German, they have another word for it, which applies to the sort of political alliances you consider as acceptable. And so in Belgium, for example, there is a cordon sanitaire for the far right. The right-wing parties try to extend it to our now pretty strong Communist Party, which we have in Belgium. But that's about political alliances, and they can have good reasons. But I'm very strongly against the cordon sanitaire de la parole, so was recently invited by MCC, which is a foundation funded by the Hungarian government, to Romania in order to speak about linguistic issues. Some people say don't accept that because it's a... No, I think this cordon sanitaire shouldn't be used as in terms of a fear to be contaminated. And so you can accept, of course, it's sometimes difficult to establish the right sort of atmosphere in which you can present your arguments, but I go and then I say, I hope as once someone in the Institute of Marxism-Leninism of the Communist Party told me, he said, I asked him, can I just speak, that was in the 1990s, can I just say freely without getting you into trouble? And he told me, and whenever I'm invited in more or less, bizarre settings or less familiar settings, I remember what he told me then. He said, you think we've invited you all the way here in order to hear you say what you think we would like to hear? You are here because we want to know what you think. And so I occasionally, when I expect people not to like what I'm going to say, I quote that, and then they're disappointed by the fact that it's not more radical than...
I'm sure that's right. I'm thinking of Jo's thought about how you've got to be careful when propounding a view that you don't become a spokesperson for a view that others want to hype. I mean, a lot of academics, all of us, I think, in the current UK system will have, complaints and gripes about how universities are run. But, when you're called up, as I've been, and maybe you've been by Russia today, would you like to come and talk about the problems in the universities? You think no, because that's not a very useful forum. So there are issues about naivety, which you raised as well, that I think we have to be careful with. Dave, the same sort of range of questions is, you also have a role as a BBC producer, radio producer, and full disclosure, you've produced me a couple of times. But when you're trying to select experts, when you're trying to think of who to have, I mean, you're looking for communicators, but you're also trying to get somebody to say something interesting and a little bit risky, not to be just on their safe territory. Where's the due diligence? Is it in calling them up, discussing with them? How do you decide whether this person really is good enough, interesting enough, maybe take them a little bit out their comfort zone, but not so far that you think they're going to say anything that you wouldn't approve of or you wouldn't think was valuable?
Well, in the world of philosophy, it's easy for me because I think there's only 600 philosophers in the UK, and I've probably met 350 of them. So I sort of know. Shall I turn this off?
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
No.
You can keep it on.
Okay.
I switch mine off. Yeah.
Okay. Is that better? But yeah, you want somebody who has something interesting to say about something interesting that they can say it accessibly, and good communicators who have something original and interesting to say. It's very simple. That's what you're looking for. But obviously, you have to do your due diligence by talking to them beforehand. On the whole, I've never got into trouble, but I know fellow producers who've booked the wrong guests. Let's put it that way.
Can you say more, or are you... No.
No.
So what makes a guest wrong?
What makes a guest wrong? If they're dull or prolix. I mean, one of the skills in being a public philosopher, Jo had his articles. He had, what do you have, 1,000 words, probably 800 words, 1,000 words. You can't be the kind of philosopher who says, on the one hand, on the other hand. There's just no time for that.
That's Emmanuel Macron, isn't it?
Yes, he does do a bit of that. But so actually the best philosophers, and this is not just a point about philosophy, it's the point about intellectuals and academics generally. The best ones are the ones who are confident enough not to have to say on the one hand or on the other hand. They're sufficiently confident in their views and in their topic to avoid the qualifiers. So that's something else you're looking for.
Good. Okay, questions? Yes, please. The microphone will come to you so people online can hear.
My question is, Dave, you talked about what it means to be, you gave a long list of Jewish philosophers, and it answered a little bit about my question. What is it indeed Jewish in the philosophy itself? What is Jewish about it? Is it because the writer is a Jew, or whether it is about Jewish themes, whether it is about Jewish experience? And you gave two conditions. One is fear, and the second one was
Freedom.
yeah. And I thought that maybe you would like to add also a third one, which is responsibility. There is I saw a few days ago an actor who said, because of what is going on now in Gaza, Jews are being attacked in New York and in London, which is, I think, also a bit of a Jewish experience. I'm not aware of another example in which the actions of members of a minority or a nationality affect in this way on members of that nationality on different areas in the world. Which brings me to maybe you and Jo would like to say a few words about it. How do you think that Judaism should respond to the issue of nationalism? Because this is an experience or a challenge in which the Jewish nation or religion never had to grapple with. Nationalism and Judaism.
So that's a very big question. We won't forget it, but I want to come back to your first question because there's something online that might just to get your responses might be pressing at what you were asking in the first case. The question is, while that Karl Marx quote is horrible, it's also said that Karl Marx's Marxism relied on a Judaic biblical notion of history, inevitability, guiding hand, steps towards inevitable messianic golden age of justice, etc. So is there anything about Judaic thinking that's informing Marx's thought? And he goes on to say, maybe Karl Marx was unaware of the Jewish faith, even though I believe his grandfather was a rabbi.
So there's a lot of questions there. How should Judaism respond? Well, Judaism, I know about as much about Judaism as probably Jo does, which is close to zero. So I can't tell you how Judaism should respond. I mean, is there such a thing as Jewish philosophy? No. There are concerns that many Jews have because of their life experience, I guess, and that's what I was talking about. I mean, one thing that's quite interesting to me is the concept of freedom, which is addressed by lots of different intellectuals, not just by philosophers, in different ways. And I think, Karl Marx thinks there are constraints on freedom through class. Chomsky thinks there are constraints on freedom through language. Levi-Strauss thinks there are constraints on freedom through culture and ritual. Derrida has constraints of freedom through, again, language as well. And it's interesting that all these thinkers, who aren't all philosophers, are also Jewish. And that might not be entirely coincidental because it may be that they they're more likely to recognize constraints on freedom than people in majority groups. So I think there's a reason why people of a minority background would be attracted to particular topics. And I don't think, I think you can give a Talmudic explanation, but I think very little of this comes from the fact that they share a kind of religious origin. In fact, most of the intellectuals that I was talking about are from very secular backgrounds. Many, the German, Czech, Austrian culture was extremely assimilated. So I think it's got very little to do with religion and much more to do with the life experiences shaping their interests.
So sociocultural. But I wondered, I mean, maybe for you, Jo, whether you think there's also some influence of Judaical thinking in Marx, the sort of inevitability, guiding hand, progress will be made, it will go in a certain direction, just so we answer the online question.
So this is often said, but the idea that there's some future state, some blissful future state, is not unique to Judaism as a religion. So I think people have said that there is what do we call it, millennialism or something that is common to lots of different views. So there were English socialists who had the same view, coming from a Methodist background, so on. I mean, the relationship between Marx and Judaism is very complicated. So his mother never really converted. He spoke Yiddish at home sometimes. Both his grandfathers were rabbis. So that goes back a long way. There are many different theories. I don't think there's a definitive view about the effects of Judaism on Marx. But those passages are anti-Semitic. And in the correspondence with Engels, it gets even worse because he uses the word Jew just as a slur of people. And he also, in some of the work, uses this type of banking and huskering as a metaphor for global capitalism. And sometimes it's for petty dealing as well. So it's really very unpleasant. When I was teaching Marxism, I just skated over all of that. It had nothing to do with the doctrine. And I now feel, I don't know what I should have done, actually, in the classroom with undergraduates, how relevant it would have been. But now it's something I'm obviously thinking much more about.
Okay, new question. James.
So this is a question for Philippe, and I think possibly Jo, if he wanted to say something about it. And I noticed there are two slightly different models of what it is to be an excellent public philosopher that are being displayed by Philippe and by Jo. Because one thing that's notable is that I think nearly all of Jo's contributions to public philosophy have been done in the context of working as part of a committee, whether for the Nuffield Council on bioethics or on railway safety. And many of the times, as it were, being asked to fulfill a public role when you're deliberating with other people trying to get to a consensus. Whereas Philippe has suggested that often what needs to happen is you go it alone, you think you know what the right answer is, you build a community, you put the stamps on, you send the things out for year after year, and people start agreeing with you eventually. And it seemed to be two different models. And I was just wondering, for many of us in the room have maybe been inspired by both of you for many years. If you're thinking about trying to build a career in public philosophy, what are the pluses and minuses of these different models?
Can you hear me like this?
Yes.
Okay. So, yes. Well, first of all, I don't think anyone should take being a public philosopher as a career. And so that is being a political philosopher as a career makes sense. Being a philosopher as a career makes sense because some people are paid as such. But it's something that you happen then to be led to do, being a public philosopher rather than a political philosopher with, you may be interested in exactly the same issue. But it just happens, it's also better for it not to happen too early in your career because you have to build up some competence in your own field. You have to build up a network of collaborations with people from other disciplines. But then it may happen sometimes because of the specific function you are given that it's part of your role, including the thing for which you are being paid. And so I was lucky enough, so the beginning of my career, I was at the National Research Foundation in Belgium, and I was happy to stay there for the whole of my life. But then the rector of our university, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, thought, yes, capitalism has won in some sense, but it doesn't mean that it's without ethical problems, and we really need our university to think more actively on these issues. And so he asked me to design. There was a foundation, Hoover Foundation, that was willing would provide an endowment, and so he asked me to design something, and so it became what became the Hoover Chair in Economic and Social Ethics. In the title, it means that there is some emphasis on the economic dimension, which was important because capitalism collapsed. Socialism collapsed. Wishful thinking, Jonas would say. For economic reasons mainly, not only. So there had to be that accent, but it had to be broader. And our university, having a Catholic tradition, social ethics came in, because social ethics in the Catholic tradition is equivalent to political philosophy. But then in the appointment letter, when I became then the first responsable of this chair, so the rector said, what we expect from you is then to make sure that there is a presence of ethical reflection in the research and the teaching of the faculty, and also une présence de l'université dans le monde. And also a presence of the university in the world, meaning we also expect from this chair to have something to say in the public domain. And so therefore, the public, this being a public philosopher became part of my job. But then in the forms it takes, and also in my case, then I occasionally took part. I don't know, the finance minister wanted to do a more ambitious reform of the tax system. He gathered a few people. In general, it was rather frustrating experiencing it. Also alluded to that, because okay, you come with your grand ideas about what to reform it, and then in the end it's a little bit at the margin. But of course, I'm not at all saying that this is without importance, because sometimes there is a good moment to move forward. So that but I believe that even in that function, it's important to be a utopian, a realistic utopian, but an opportunistic utopian. You take advantage of, sometimes there is an opening and you take advantage. And in that function too, it's important to be a responsible non-expert. And you are there, you benefit also from the competences of the other people in the commission. And so for me, there is first of all, there is a whole continuum in the extent to which political philosophers or academics in general can be also public intellectuals or public philosophers. It depends on the circumstance, on the temperaments of the people, on the demands of society more broadly, of their institution. But also, if you are a public philosopher, there is a whole range of things in a continuum, and that goes from managing to get a movement of civil disobedience going to just sitting around the table with a few civil servants. And I don't know what your experience was.
So I think I'll hold fire on this, because I'm going to talk about it in my talk, which is almost now.
Almost now. So just to end, and this is really for you, I think, is the third way with being a public philosopher. So somebody asks, to whatever degree it's possible to do philosophy on blue sky, what, if any, are its advantages over books, articles, conference talks, and the classroom?
It's very quick, very short, and you can delete it if it's wrong.
Excellent. So will you join me in thanking our speakers, Dave Edmonds and Philip Van?
Fascinating story. I read the written version of your paper. It's just incredible. But on freedom, there are lots of non-Jewish people who wrote that. So
having listened to everybody else, it's now time to hear Jo Wolff himself, the public philosopher, Jo.
So this has been a really amazing day, and when it was suggested that this was going to happen, I'll say a bit more about that. The first thought that came into my mind was the conference in the honor of Jerry Cohen, my teacher. I'll talk more about him. His name's come up a couple of times. A few years ago in Oxford, and he began his reflections, or at least early on, he said that it's very strange that in this country, the way people honor you is by tearing your work apart. So I was wondering what I was in for today. I haven't experienced, I think, very much tearing my work apart. I thought, so why is that? Well, I don't have any theories, so that's an advantage. So no one can refute anything. Laura found something, very grateful for a little bit of challenge and pushback. But it's been a really incredible day for me. A number of you, half a dozen, I think, braved UK border control to get here, which was really heroic. To hear 6 or 7 of my former and current PhD students present their work, friends, colleagues, it's really remarkable to have heard these talks. And also something else that Jerry Cohen said at that time was how wonderful it is to go on to see your former students become their own person. And that's what I've seen here. Jerry then went on to read quite a lot of poetry, which I'm not going to do. But I'll talk a little bit about my pathway into where I am and where I started, and maybe where I'm going, maybe not, maybe not. So I left school in 1977. I didn't go to university. I hadn't done very well at school. I decided not to go to university, so I went out to work in the legal department of the Prudential Insurance Company. I worked there for 3 years, and that's why I was never afraid of university administration. Because I knew that what we call administration, other people call work. And it's a privilege not to be doing it all day long. 1980, I enrolled, had incredible fortune, stroke of luck in a number of ways, at UCL to study philosophy. And I there came under the influence of many people, but the one who was most striking is Jerry Cohen. And I suppose I really learnt how to do philosophy to begin with from Jerry. And Jerry is a very distinctive person. You've heard he is Canadian, or was Canadian, Jewish, Marxist. But he was also trained at Oxford. And being trained at Oxford gave you a certain type of style. Being Jerry, it went twice as fast as anyone else. But the way you did philosophy was, or at least had a discussion, was you would speak to someone and say, what are you working on? And they would say, equality. And you'd say, what's your thesis? And they'd say, there should be equality of resources. Well, you can't think that, because what about people who don't work? So I said, oh, no, of course. And so you would develop an understanding of the other person's position by challenging them and challenging them and challenging them. And that was just normal. So that is how I learned to do philosophy. And we were all doing it, really, as undergraduates. But I also found it had this sort of magic effect, because when I spoke to friends who were doing English or history, who weren't trained like that, they just thought we were brilliantly clever, because we were focusing on so hard, pushing them, but that was just the training. So that's what I thought doing philosophy was. You got people to state their thesis, you gave them a counterexample, they replied to it, refined their thesis, and you carry on and carry on. I can see a few people who were trained like this. So I did well as an undergraduate, so I carried on at UCL and did the MPhil to begin with under Jerry Cohen's supervision. But he left UCL to come here to Oxford when I was about halfway through. And I had run out of scholarship money. So in those days, there was a limit to how much you could get. And I'd had 2 years grant to do the MPhil. And there was no way I could have a scholarship in the UK to do a PhD, and I couldn't afford it. Family couldn't have afforded it. So I applied to go to the States, and I was lucky enough to get a place at Harvard to do a PhD. And I was introduced to one of the people who would eventually teach me. He came to give some lectures in London. And I was allowed not to go to the dinner, of course, but for drinks before dinner. So I went to the drinks before dinner. And there was someone from here who had been one of his students in America. And their conversation went like this. What are you working on? And he said, well, there's a passage in Locke where he says something. Why do you find that interesting? Well, I believe that interest is relative. There's no general reason. And then they got into a discussion of what made something a philosophical question. And I'd never heard anything like that. I just heard this stuff about bang, 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 argument, argument, argument. And I was very confused because I thought, well, wherever they started, they would end up in the same place discussing what philosophy was. Anyway, I went to Harvard, and sure enough, that's what happened to me. I thought I was going to only go for a year and work with Rawls and Scanlon. Well, what happened was, the reason I was only going to go for a year was that Jerry had left UCL, got a job in Oxford, and he left a Jerry-shaped hole at UCL, and they decided they wanted to fill it with someone who could teach the same things as Jerry did, which is very unusual: Marxism, political philosophy, and general philosophy. There was almost no one in the country who could do that. There were 4 of us, and we'd all been taught by Jerry, and so we were the shortlist for his job. And so we were all asked to apply for this job, and it was a time when there were almost no jobs around in philosophy, so it was incredible. So there I was, and after some deliberation, they took 6 weeks to decide to offer me the job, but they did. And I hadn't even finished my MPhil at that point, so I had had 5 years in philosophy, not even 5 years. So we all agreed that I would go off to Harvard for a year and get a bit more experience and do something different and come back. So I was going to go and work with Scanlon and Rawls. They didn't know that. And what I didn't know was, so this was long before the internet, long before being able to find anything out, long before email. And they were both on sabbatical for the whole year that I was there. So instead, I worked with a man called Burton Drebin, who was the one who had this conversation about, is this an interesting question? And also Hilary Putnam as the main people I worked with, which was an amazing experience for me, but so different to Oxford philosophy. So much was about what are we doing in philosophy? What are we trying to do? What are we trying to do with the subjects? I was used to reading journal articles and finding problems with them. At Harvard, they read a journal article and said, well, why would anyone write that? And that was actually quite hard to know the answer, and often, because someone else had written another journal article, and you were replying to it. So I went to Harvard with these ideas. I worked with Rawls and Scanlon. I would have some papers ready to be published. At Harvard, at that time, they had the attitude that if you're under about 40 and tried to publish anything, that was a bit vulgar. And you were sort of strongly discouraged from doing anything. So I went to Harvard thinking I knew what philosophy was and how to do it, and I came back not knowing what philosophy was and not knowing how to do it, but I had a job. And I had to work out what my research would be like. And I'd lost faith in the things I'd written before. It took me a while to come back to them. So I floundered around the first summer, not really making much progress with anything. And then early in the next year, Mike Rosen, who's sitting here, came to me and said, would you like to write a book on Nozick? And I thought, what a terrible idea. That is, I would hate to write a book on Nozick. No, because Mike had been asked to write a book on Nozick for policy and didn't want to do it, and asked me if I would like to do it. And then the next day I thought, well, actually, I haven't been able to settle on a good research project. And this is a self-contained task, and it will have a deadline, and I'll have a contract, so why not? So I did. So I signed the contract, wrote the book, enjoyed writing it, and it was quite a liberating thing for me because it was a sort of student text. So the idea was to write it in a way that anyone could understand, which was a great first thing to do in philosophy. And it sort of, I just kept on writing like that as much as I could. So rather than thinking that there's this technical vocabulary that I have to show I'm familiar with, I thought actually it's more impressive if people actually understand what you say, rather than thinking, oh, he must be clever because he can use those words. Right?
So I wrote the book on Nozick, and Mike was incredibly supportive. And another philosopher, very few people here will know, Bill Hart, W.D. Hart, was equally supportive. And so my career went on. By this time, I was the departmental tutor, doing all the interviews and all the administration in the department. And it was really extraordinary, actually, how much admin I was doing. But I somehow managed to survive. And then, but my career at that point was just as a standard political philosopher, writing a few papers. But then another extraordinary thing happened, which was I got a phone call asking me to phone the Home Office, the Department of Gaming, Liquor and Data Protection. And I'm not making that up. Right? So I thought that I was going to be told off for violating data protection somehow, which I probably had done. But no, it was a civil servant asking me if I would sit on a committee to review gambling law in the UK. And what had happened was that my head of department then, Malcolm Budd, had been asked by the civil servant, who was someone he had taught at Cambridge, whether he would be interested in sitting on this committee. Malcolm hated doing anything like that, but he thought it would be something I might consider. So that was how I moved from just being a standard political philosopher to someone who paid attention to matters of public policy, because I just got this thing out of the blue. And I thought it would be fun. I had to visit gambling establishments. I went to the Dogs for the first time, went to a spread betting office. I also thought it would be very easy, because I'd been, by that time, teaching John Stuart Mill for 10 years. I knew about the harm principle, and that people should be able to do what they like as long as they don't harm other people. Luckily, I didn't say that out loud on the committee, because no country has ever had a gambling policy as liberal as that. And I thought, actually, before I make any recommendations, I better find out what the policy is here before I tell them what to do. And that was about 2 years' work, just trying to find out what the rules and regulations were. So I put my other research to one side for a couple of years to try, while we were working on this, and we came up with recommendations, and eventually the committee came up with a report. Most of it was accepted by the government. Quite a bit of it went into law, including some disastrous bits I'll talk about another time. But I greatly enjoyed this experience. I learned quite a lot. One thing I learned was that philosophical theories are no help at all if you use them undiluted in public policy. You can't just go from a theory to a policy. And if you're going to say anything sensible, you need to know about current regulations, but you need to know about the history, you need to know what goes on in other countries. So before you can really engage in this type of work I was doing, you had to do a lot of reading, and you had to do a lot of talking to people. And I think during this, sort of retrospectively, I realized that insofar as I have any special skills in the subject, I realized the two sort of fairly closely related came out of this. So one is I turn out to be very good at translating English into English. That's my speciality. So you have people who are specialists in their own area who talk in jargon. And I seem to be able to pick it up quite quickly and explain it to other people around the table. So I was like what was the thing in Hitchhiker's Guide, the Babel fish, or Google Translate of 1999 vintage. The other thing, and I realize that I'm not unique here, but it's not all that common among philosophers, is having the attitude I can learn from literally anyone. So I want to listen, I want to hear, and I might change my philosophical views on the basis of a conversation with anyone. So rather than thinking that I'm in broadcast mode all the time, and according to my family I am, but anyway, occasionally listening, trying to work out what you can learn from anyone, thinking about it, reflecting on it. So I think that's what I learned from these committees. So I went on to do other work in the public domain, working on railway safety, drug regulation, about a dozen other things. But at the same time, I was running things like the Priority in Practice network. I can't say I'd forgotten about it, but I hadn't thought about it for quite some time. It was quite a nostalgic moment to see the 2008 style web page that was up there. We wouldn't use those colors these days. And it was very perceptive, Ingrid, to see that in those days I was talking about applying theories. And I don't talk about applying theories anymore. I talk about something very different to that. So what has happened? What changed? So when I was doing the public policy work, I didn't regard it as part of my academic work. So I didn't even put these reports on my CV, amazingly. So I was a co-author of a government report. It wasn't on my academic CV because I regarded it as like a distraction. I almost hid the work I was doing rather than publicize it. People were pleased I was doing it, but I felt sort of that was another life. So I kept those things separate. And it was really, I hate to give the research exercise any praise at all. But when the impact agenda came in, suddenly I was gold because I had all these things. So these things started going on my CV, my publication list got longer, and people were very pleased that I was doing this because this was now part of the impact agenda. Before it had been a distraction that you hide. Now it was part of the impact agenda. And another thing happened around this time. So I was working on relational equality, and I was very troubled by the problem that people who work on relational equality are very good at saying what they're against. So we're against hierarchy, normally, most hierarchies. We're against exploitation, we're against manipulation, we're against social stratification, and so on. So we're against all these things. What are we in favor of? Now, what is that positive thing we're in favor of, right? And you can say something, but it tends to be either far too general or far too specific. So it's a very hard problem to me to say, what is it? What positive relations do relational egalitarians want? So I just got stuck on this, and I stopped working on it. Then at a certain point, I realized in my public policy work, I always started from the negative, what was wrong. So I always started from what is wrong in the world and how can we make the world better. Knowing that in public policy, you're always trying to justify change from a status quo. So whatever issue you're working on, there is already a policy in place. So your question is not is the best policy, your question is how can we improve on where we are in a justified way that politicians would agree with, which is a much, much more limited thing. So if you start from the negative, I thought, actually, I can do this in thinking about equality as well. So instead of thinking about social equality, I started thinking about social inequality. And what can we do to reduce social inequality? And then I realized I wasn't alone by any means on this. So one of the most famous books recently in the whole wide world of philosophy is probably Miranda Fricker's book called Epistemic Injustice. It's not called Epistemic Justice. Charles Mills was writing about racial injustice, not justice. And you look back, Iris Marion Young was doing similar things, Judith Sklar was doing the same thing. Relating to Philippe on getting old and optimism, there is a lovely passage from Stuart Hampshire when he said, when I was young, I believed this would be a just society. Now, as I'm getting older, I no longer have faith that this is a correct prescription, the correct utopia. But I have no doubt that poverty is a bad thing and should be eliminated. Exploitation is a bad thing. There are too many people dying too young and so on. So I have complete faith that I am right that these things are bad and wrong and unjust, but I couldn't tell you what is just or the best society. So that is where I have developed. So instead of looking for the utopia, and I absolutely respect people who do look for utopia, I don't have any, not even realistic ones. Well, a little bit. Actually, I think several people have said methodology used depends on the subject area, and I completely agree with that. So there are some areas like disability where I am more utopian in my thinking because I think you have to be in order to make any progress there. But other areas, you start with the bad things in the world and try to make them better. So that is the progress for maturity to me. And also, Ingrid pointed out that I've used these two different terms, engaged philosophy and real-world philosophy. And Mark, I don't know if Mark is still here, this morning asked a question about whether engaged philosophy was how to engage with people outside philosophy or how to do philosophy, which I thought was a very useful question. What I've realized is I use real world philosophy when it's what we're doing inside, and engaged philosophy when it's how we interact with people outside, even if they could be the same things, even if they should converge. So I think what I've seen, as well as moving towards a negative, is seeing the public policy work I've been doing converging more and more with the academic work, to a point where they're really now, a lot of it, not all of it, is in pretty much the same place. So while I was doing this work, Avner has told the story about how we came to write Disadvantage. What I remember is I was giving a talk for that book. What I remember is that I was giving a talk about equality at one of these things, and Avner asked a brilliant question, or it was a comment really, rather than a question, of course, where Avner said, well, you know, I'm on committees in Israel and people are coming to us because they're worried about things that might happen rather than things that have happened. So they're worried that their kids will get run over. No kid has been run over yet. And we thought, well, this is very interesting because this is about risk and vulnerability. And who is the philosopher of risk and vulnerability in political philosophy? At that time, there wasn't really someone who was working on things other than distribution or states of affairs. So we then came up with this idea of having a pluralist theory of well-being or disadvantage, where risk and security become central to the view. So that, I think, is gestation. The rest of the story I completely agree with. I think it's amazing, actually, looking back at that book, when people ask us who wrote which bit, and we don't know. So we don't even know who first drafted some of it. Some of it I remember. The bits you didn't like, I remember writing those bits, right? Particularly at the end of the book. He said, do we need that chapter? Do we need the last chapter? And a reviewer, I don't know if it was a friend of yours, said, did they really need that last chapter? So maybe you were right about that. But on the whole, I just don't know where the ideas came from. And the City of Equals book is a bit different because that was very much more your project that you invited me into because you were working on cities. But for Disadvantage, it was very much a joint production all along. So we did that work, Disadvantage. I wrote up the work I had been doing on public committees and published it as Ethics and Public Policy, which was very convenient because I became Dean of Arts and Humanities for a few years at UCL, and it was okay, but I didn't want to go any further in the administration, and it was a bit strange going back to the department when you've been Dean. And Nairi managed to convince me that this was the job I should be taking here. And it was a very interesting experience. It was very, very quick. It was most peculiar because we conducted the salary negotiations even before the interview on the grounds that if we didn't agree salary, there was no point in an interview, which is a very sensible, pragmatic approach, but I think maybe unique here. So we conducted all of that, and so when they offered me the job, I had already said I was going to take it. So there I was, sort of snookered by Nairi. I had absolutely no regrets about taking it, but no one could explain to me what the job was. And I knew nothing. The school was very new. The website didn't really explain very much from the academic point of view. So I didn't know what it was. I also didn't know what research I'd be expected to do. And it was time for me to do something different, I thought. So I thought, well, public policy, I'd been working on risk and regulation. I thought that must be what they want, risk and regulation. So I started working on risk and regulation. But then I got here, and I was under no pressure at all to do any work in any direction. It was really my own free choice, except that I think there would have been a little bit of a disappointment if I hadn't done something more philosophical than everyone else in the school. So coming from a department of philosophy, I was by far the most applied person. Coming here, I was the blue skies thinker. So I started thinking about democracy, nationalism. And then at that time, the immense good fortune, Alfred Landecker Foundation, as Nairi explained, wanted to endow a chair here, and it fitted me perfectly because it's a chair about Holocaust memorialization. And I don't think people here knew that this is our family history. My two brothers two of my brothers are here. So it's our family history of our grandparents and many other family members, more distant family members, perishing in the Holocaust. So to have a chair funded by a foundation dedicated to Holocaust memorialization, and them not wanting me particularly to work on Holocaust memorialization, which I'd never done before, so they were quite happy for me to work on democracy. So that was my plan. So I gave an inaugural lecture, wrote a couple of blogs. I was going to work on democracy. And then the pandemic happened, and that had a peculiar effect, because in the past I'd written about global health. So I wrote a little book on the human right to health. With James, I'd been teaching at UCL before. We set up an MA in the PPE of health, philosophy, politics, economics of health. We've got a couple of people who took that course actually in the room today. So now I'd been working on health justice. We had a Center for Ethics and a Center for Justice, Philosophy and Health, I think.
Philosophy, justice.
Yeah, philosophy and justice. So I'd been working on global health. Then when the pandemic struck, just about every philosopher who had ever used the word health in any of their articles was suddenly recruited by someone to write something about health. So I found myself on a committee with Cecile, writing papers on vaccines. There was another little group that I was in, and I was also asked by the World Health Organization to chair or co-chair a panel on the governance of the ACT Accelerator, who was the group that had COVAX. And so we were looking at the ethics and governance of the organization that was supposedly distributing the vaccine around the world, which was challenging because the organization denied that it had a governance structure, but we were meant to be looking at its governance structure. So that was a bit peculiar. But for 2 or 3 years, I did almost nothing but COVID-related work. And then City of Equals returned. That we had been working on this before the pandemic. I think it stalled a bit during the pandemic. No more interviews could be done. And we did that work. And so that is how I got from being a legal clerk for the Prudential Insurance Company to more or less where I am now, a bit more of the story. But before I tell where I'm going from here now, I just want to say some thanks. So Shai, this has been an incredible thing to put together. In fact, Shai wasn't the first person to mention the possibility. I think Katerina was. And then a couple of other people also mentioned it. And I kept, no, we don't want that, don't want that. And Shai mentioned it and appeared prepared to do the work for it. And I couldn't turn that down, and then got in touch with the events team here. And the team behind the scenes has just done an incredible job. You occasionally see Jamie coming up to the front, fiddling with people's microphones, but there's a whole infrastructure behind that keeps it in the catering and the events and so on. I need to thank the Alfred Landecker Foundation because it has been incredibly supportive. You saw the two CEOs. I need to thank Nairi for having the faith to bring me here, not knowing very much about me other than what people had said. Elaine, well, we met as undergraduates in September 1980, and we've been together since. And 2 of my 3 brothers are here, Richard and Ben, and everyone has been completely supportive, even when they have no idea what I'm doing, but they have some idea. And I think there are family members who claim to have at least opened one of my books. I don't know if they got much further than that, but who can blame them, really?
The pension was dedicated to us.
There was something dedicated. Yeah, there was something dedicated. Yeah. So what next? So in 1980, I got a scholarship, full scholarship from the government. It was incredible now, not just the fees paid. And I also got unemployment benefit in the holidays as well. And I had a council flat, so everything was paid for. MPhil was paid for 2 years. I went to the States, that was paid for. I got a job. And I thought, well, actually, I never formed the ambition to be an academic. It was never on my radar. So even when I was doing the MPhil, there were so few jobs. Thatcher was closing down universities. and philosophy departments were suffering particularly. And Barry, you started at the same time. And it just was not something that had occurred to me. And so when at UCL said apply for this job, it was completely out of the blue. And then to get it was remarkable. But I formed that thought, and I've said to people quite often, in 1980, they started paying me to do philosophy, and I will continue doing it until they stop paying me. Well, that's 2 weeks' time. So now I have a decision to make about whether I'm true to my word. I said I'd continue doing it as long as they pay me. I didn't say I would stop if they didn't pay me. So what am I going to do? So with Lucy, I'm working with the Royal Institute of Philosophy, so I cannot escape philosophy for another 3 years. I've got various obligations of people. So the first paper I ever refereed or ever accepted for a journal was called The Logical Structure of Temptation. And it said there are moments in life where you are as strong as your strongest moment, and there are moments where you're as weak as your weakest moment. And academia is set up to make us as weak as our weakest moment. So you can say no to 100 things, but 101 comes along, and that's you committed for the next 3 months to something. So I think I have this policy of saying no to everything. So why is my to-do list as it is? So some people manage to get under the radar and get me to do things. So I'm not going to stop doing philosophy, but I am going to try to do some other things. So a couple of people have mentioned me as a storyteller, and that's what I think I am. I tell stories, and I use stories to tell philosophy. So I'm going to do other types of writing, and try to do other types of writing as well, which are more about telling stories. I mean, not fiction necessarily, but a mixture of ideas and stories and life, related to family history, related to philosophy, related to some of the things that Dave was talking about. Dave's talk was a very, very interesting topic. Jewish thought, less so than Jewish thinkers, really. It was about Jewish thinkers. But it also made me reflect on when I first started writing about Jewish topics. And I can date it now to 2016, so not very long ago. And it was during the Syrian refugee crisis. And Syrians were being demonized in the press and about how refugees are a drain on resources. So I thought there was a sort of moral responsibility for anyone who was from a refugee background, as I am, to make that fact clear. And so I published a third edition of my Introduction to Moral Philosophy, Political Philosophy in 2016. And OUP asked me to write a blog to publicize it. So I wrote something that I called 3 Generations of Asylum Seekers. And the point was that my family are the descendants of 3 generations of asylum seekers. So my father came on the Kindertransport. My grandmother came from what is now Ukraine, the generation before my mother's mother. My mother's father was born in the East End of London, St. George's in the East End, but his family came from Poland, or what was Russian Empire there. So 3 generations of asylum seekers. And I thought that many people, I don't know, Dave, whether you're 1 generation or 2 generations of asylum seekers, 1 generation, so it all came together. Yeah. But Mike, probably you've got the similar story. So many of us who have, to put it hubristically, have achieved something, have got a refugee background. And this needs to be better known, I thought. So that's what I did. And then the Alfred Landlecker Foundation made me think much more about the Holocaust, my own family history in relation to the Holocaust. And so I'm still thinking along those lines. So that's where I am. I might report back in a couple of years to tell you why the stories didn't work out and why I'm back to writing a third book with Avner, maybe called Village of Equals. Anyway, thank you for your attention. Oh, I have an announcement, a strange announcement. So one of the things about this being my last academic job is I have to move out of my office. And we do not have at home room for anything like the books I've got here. So there are about 400 books in my office that tomorrow are going to Oxfam, unless they're taken today, or some of them are taken today. So if anyone is feeling they could do with a few more philosophy books in their collection, and these are relatively recent, mostly bought with the school's money, over the last few years by very generous research allowance. So I'll open my office door immediately after this on the 3rd floor, room 327. And if anyone goes and takes even one book, that's me. That means I've got one less book to pack up tomorrow when I send them off. Okay, so thank you very much. And Shai, again, let me thank you for the incredible conference you put together. Oh, no, you're not going to give me a book, are you?
First of all, let's thank